The moon hung high over the vampire dominion, casting a cold silver glow upon the towering spires of Celine's castle. The fortress, built of black marble and ancient magic, loomed over the endless expanse of darkness below. Inside its halls, where shadows moved like living things, the vampire queen stood before her court, draped in a gown as dark as the abyss, her beauty as chilling as death itself. Celine was perfection in flesh, a creature sculpted by time itself. Sharp cheekbones, lips like blood, and eyes the color of midnight. She was untouchable, worshipped and feared, a goddess wrapped in cold, immortal silk. Tonight, she laughed. Her voice, a melody both haunting and cruel, echoed through the grand chamber. Her court laughed with her, their faces twisted in delight, their fangs gleaming beneath the candlelight. The conversation had turned to humans, weak, fleeting creatures bound to their mortal cycles of life and death. And worse, the most pathetic fate of all, childbirth. Celine smirked, swirling the dark wine in her goblet. The burden of flesh, the agony of breeding. "It is beneath us," she said, her voice dripping with amusement. "To create life like mere beasts, a laughable weakness." The vampires agreed, their laughter cruel, their hunger for destruction never-ending. But beyond the castle walls, in the wild lands where moonlight burned the earth, another kind of beast listened. Darien. He crouched on the outskirts of the dominion, his golden eyes fixed upon the towering palace. Even at this distance, he could smell her, the scent of cold night air, of forbidden power, intoxicating, infuriating. The queen's words reached his ears, her laughter like a dagger in his chest. She mocked creation. She mocked bloodline. She mocked what she could never understand. Darien was no ordinary werewolf. He was blood moon-born, a warrior cursed and blessed by an ancient force that even his own kind feared. He was power incarnate, a beast who had ripped through vampire armies, leaving their bodies broken beneath the crimson glow of his cursed moon. And yet, this woman, this goddess of death, stirred something inside him that no battle ever had. He had seen her before, from the shadows, from the battlefield, from the nightmares that haunted his sleep. Celine. And no matter how much he hated her, he wanted her. Darien stepped forward, the shadows wrapping around his massive form as his breath came slow and measured. The leather straps of his armor tightened against his broad chest as his hands curled into fists. The beast within him snarled, whispering what he already knew. "She is yours. She just doesn't know it yet." But Celine was no helpless maiden. From the throne room, she felt it, the shift in the air, the electric pull of something unseen. Her smile faltered for only a moment before she raised her goblet to her lips. Her court was oblivious, but she was not. Something watched her, something wild. Her power stretched outward, searching. And then, for a fraction of a second, she felt it. A presence, a hunger that was not human, not vampire. A growl rumbled through the night, low and primal. Celine's lips parted. A thrill, sharp, unexpected, ran through her veins. And for the first time in centuries, the vampire queen knew what it was to be hunted. The night wind whispered through the towering spires of Celine's castle, carrying the distant howls of unseen predators. It was a warning, low, guttural, and primal. But the vampire queen did not fear the dark. She was the dark. Celine stood at the highest balcony, her gown flowing like liquid shadow, her pale skin luminous beneath the moon's cold gaze. Below her, the kingdom stretched endlessly, bathed in silver mist. She closed her eyes, reaching out with her senses, searching for the presence that had unsettled her. There, a force, vast and untamed, pressed against the edges of her awareness. It was unlike anything she had ever encountered, raw, violent, and alive. A hunger that rivaled her own. It washed her. It wanted her. She smiled, baring perfect fangs. "Come, then." Far beyond the castle walls, Darien moved. He stalked through the wilderness, his every step silent despite his massive form. His body was a predator's masterpiece. broad shoulders, taut muscle, strength coiled like a storm inside him. He was not simply a beast. He was dominance made flesh, the nightmare of every vampire who had ever dared to cross into werewolf lands. And yet tonight, he walked willingly into the lioness's den. Celine's scent still lingered in the air, a contradiction of ice and fire. He wanted to despise it. Instead, it called to something deep inside him. She was untouchable. She was unnatural. And yet, the moment he had sensed her, the moment he had heard her mock the very essence of creation, something inside him had snapped. She would learn. She would learn what it meant to be claimed by something stronger. Darian moved faster, the wind shifting around him as he neared the castle gates. The stone walls towered like a fortress of nightmares. But he didn't stop. A wolf does not fear a cage. It simply breaks it. Inside, Celine sensed the shift in the air. Then, like a phantom emerging from the mist, he was there. The chamber doors burst open with a force that shattered the silence. Every candle flickered. Every shadow recoiled. The court, draped in velvet and arrogance, turned as one, eyes flashing, fangs bared. And in the center of it all stood him. Darian stepped forward, the glow of the torches casting a golden sheen over his skin. He was tall, powerful, exuding the kind of dominance that made lesser creatures bow instinctively. His eyes, wolf's eyes, molten and piercing, locked onto Celine's. And for the first time in centuries, she felt the weight of a gaze that did not worship, did not cower. It dared. Celine rose from her throne, moving like smoke. "A wolf," she murmured, tilting her head in amusement. "Strayed too far from his den, has he?" Darian's lips curled into a half-smile, sharp and knowing. "A queen," he countered, voice deep as thunder, "ruling over a kingdom of corpses." The court hissed. A dozen vampires vanished into the shadows, ready to strike. Celine lifted a single hand. They froze. Her eyes, dark as midnight, never left his. This beast, he was different. He was not afraid. And worse, neither was she. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken challenge, with something far more dangerous than hate. Darian took another step. He was close enough now for her to feel the heat radiating from his body, close enough for her senses to be overwhelmed by the scent of raw earth and blood. Celine smirked. "Tell me, wolf, did you come to beg for mercy?" Darian's voice was a low, rumbling growl. "No, vampire." His eyes burned into hers. "I came to make you understand." A heartbeat of stillness. And then, the air cracked like lightning. Celine struck first. Faster than a whisper, she lunged, her form a blur of shadow and steel. But Darian, he was ready. He caught her wrist midair. The impact sent a shockwave through the chamber. For the first time in her immortal life, someone stopped her. Celine's breath hitched. Darian's grip was firm, unyielding, not the touch of a lover, not the grasp of a king. It was possession. And for the first time, the Queen of the Night realized she was no longer the hunter. She was the prey. The castle walls trembled with the weight of their clash. Darian's grip was unyielding, fingers locked around Celine's delicate wrist. She had moved like shadow, a whisper of death, but he had caught her midair, a force of nature meeting another. Their eyes locked, fire against ice. A silent battle raged between them, not of fangs or claws, but will. Celine's lips parted, revealing sharp fangs, but Darian only tightened his hold. His body was searing heat, an inferno against her frozen elegance. She should have been furious. She should have been repulsed. But something dangerous slithered through her veins instead. Exhilaration. No man, no creature, had ever dared to challenge her like this. No one had ever stopped her. A slow, knowing smirk curved Darian's lips. Surprised, vampire. His voice was deep, thick with the kind of confidence that came from absolute power. Celine's chin lifted, her pride untouchable even now. Amused, wolf. Faster than a blink, She twisted, her body fluid as silk. She barely touched the ground before she was behind him, her breath cool against his neck. "But you are slow." Darian growled low, turning to face her, and Celine felt it. The weight of his presence, the sheer force of his dominance. He did not cower. He did not yield. Instead, he moved, faster than a beast of his size should. Before she could slip into the shadows, his hand seized her waist, slamming her back against the stone pillar with a force that stole the air from the room. A gasp, a sharp intake of breath. Not from pain. From something far more sinful. Darian was close now. Too close. His body was heat and power, his scent all-consuming. Earth, blood, something wild that stirred a hunger Celine didn't recognize. His voice was a low whisper inches from her lips. "Run." Celine's pulse, dead for centuries, roared back to life. She was the queen of the undying, the nightmare of men, yet standing in his grasp, she felt. Prey. Her fingers curled against his chest, nails grazing skin as if testing his strength. Solid. Unyielding. Alive. A slow, wicked smile curved her lips. "And if I don't?" Darian's golden eyes darkened. His fingers flexed against her waist, muscles tensing like a wolf on the edge of losing control. Celine had seen men kneel for her. She had seen them worship her, offer their throats with trembling devotion. But this was something else entirely. He did not worship, he claimed. Darian leaned in, his breath warm against her skin. "Then I'll make you." Celine's nails dug in, a silent dare. She should have broken his hold, should have vanished into the night like mist. But she didn't. Instead, she tilted her head, exposing the pale column of her throat. A provocation. A challenge. Darian growled, low and hungry, the sound vibrating deep in his chest. She was playing with fire, and he would burn her for it. But before either of them could take that final step, a sudden crash shattered the moment. The doors burst open, and the scent of blood filled the air. A vampire guard staggered inside, his body ripped open, fresh wounds still gushing. "My queen." His voice choked off as he collapsed. Beyond him, the night howled with something far more monstrous than a werewolf. Darian and Celine turned at once. The dance between them was unfinished, but the hunt had just begun. The scent of fresh blood thickened the air. Celine's gaze flicked to the guard's crumpled body, torn open like a discarded offering. The flickering torchlight made the pooling crimson shimmer, a cruel contrast against the cold stone floor. Darian inhaled deeply, his golden eyes darkening. This was not his kill. Something else had entered the castle, something that reeked of decay and madness. Celine stepped forward, her movement fluid, graceful, but Darian caught her wrist. The feel of his fingers on her skin was like fire against ice, a jarring contrast that sent a strange pulse through her body. She turned her head sharply, her silver hair cascading over her shoulder like liquid moonlight. "Unhand me, wolf." Darian didn't. Instead, he pulled her closer. Her body barely brushed his, but the heat was suffocating, a tangible force crackling between them like an untamed storm. His voice was low, rough. "Whatever did this is still inside your walls." Celine's lips parted, but before she could speak, a sound slithered through the darkness, a wet, dragging noise. The shadows beyond the shattered doors shifted, twisted, and then it stepped into the light. A creature of nightmares. Its body was a grotesque blend of human and beast, flesh stretched too thin over elongated limbs. Hollow, sunken eyes locked onto Celine, and its mouth, jagged, broken, filled with too many teeth, split into something resembling a grin. "My queen," it rasped. "You smell different." Darian moved before Celine could. A blur of motion, a snarl like thunder. He was on the creature in an instant, fangs flashing, claws ripping. The thing shrieked, its blackened blood splattering across the stone, sizzling where it touched. Celine should have been furious, should have felt insulted that the wolf had intervened before she had even drawn her blade. Instead, she watched, mesmerized. Darian fought with a brutality that was beautiful in its savagery. There was no hesitation, no wasted movement. He did not fight like a man. He fought like a force of nature. The creature slashed at him, black claws cutting deep into his shoulder, but Darian didn't flinch. He bared his fangs, golden eyes glowing with something almost primal. And then he tore out its throat with his teeth. Silence. The creature slumped to the floor, its body twitching before going still. Darian straightened, the glow in his eyes dimming as he wiped the back of his hand across his mouth. The dark blood smeared across his lips only made him look more dangerous, more untamed. Celine exhaled slowly, stepping closer. She should have been disgusted. She wasn't. Instead, her fingers lifted, ghosting over the deep wound on his shoulder. The flesh was already beginning to knit together, muscle shifting, bone mending. Fast. Too fast. She frowned. That thing was not of this world. Darian's hand shot up, grabbing her wrist again. But this time, his grip was different. Less forceful. More deliberate. Neither am I. His voice was softer now, but no less intense. Celine searched his face, this impossible creature who had entered her domain, challenged her, fought for her. She had mocked the idea of human reproduction. She had ruled for centuries without companionship, without needing anyone. Then why did this beast make her pulse race in ways it never should? His fingers tightened just slightly. We should hunt together, vampire. Celine arched a delicate brow. A pact with a werewolf. What would my court think? Darian's lips curled, amusement flickering in his molten eyes. I don't care what they think. Neither did she. Not anymore. A wicked smile played on her lips as she pulled her wrist free, but not before letting her fingers linger against his just a moment longer than necessary. Then let us hunt. And as they disappeared into the darkness, side by side, the line between predator and prey blurred forever. The night stretched endlessly before them, a velvet shroud over the ancient forest. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something darker, blood, death, hunger. Darian moved like a shadow through the trees, his golden eyes burning through the mist. Beside him, Celine was silent, her presence like moonlight itself, cold, untouchable, yet intoxicating. They had hunted together before, but never like this. This was no game of dominance, no battle of pride. Something far more primal had taken root between them. Celine could feel it in the way Darian moved, his body coiled with restrained power, his gaze flickering to her between each breath. He was hunting the creatures that lurked in her kingdom, the ones that had dared to defy her. Yet beneath that, beneath the blood and violence, he was hunting her, and she was letting him. The silence shattered with a growl. A figure darted between the trees, its elongated limbs moving unnaturally fast. Another abomination. Darian lunged, the ground cracking beneath his force. Celine didn't move to stop him. Instead, she watched, fascinated, entranced. The werewolf tore through the creature like it was nothing. Brutal, unforgiving. There was no hesitation, no mercy. And Celine, the queen of death itself, felt something stir deep inside her. Something dark. Something she had not felt in centuries. When Darian rose from the carcass, his chest rising and falling with deep, heavy breaths, his golden eyes locked onto hers, as if he had felt it too. Blood smeared his lips, but all Celine saw was the man beneath the beast. A warrior, a predator, a king in his own right. Darian stepped closer, his movements slow, deliberate, as if he were testing her, waiting to see if she would flee. She did not. She held her ground as he reached out, as his fingers traced the delicate curve of her jaw. You should fear me, vampire. His voice was rough, deep, a warning and a promise. Celine's lips curled into something sharp, something dangerous. I do not fear beasts, Darian. His fingers slid lower, brushing against the hollow of her throat. He could feel it, how still she was, how unnatural. No heartbeat, no breath. Yet here she stood, more alive than anything he had ever known. Darian leaned in, his voice a whisper against her skin. Then why do you tremble? Celine did not answer. Because the truth was something she could not speak. She did not tremble from fear. She trembled from want. It was madness. A werewolf and a vampire. Predator and predator. But as Darian pulled back, as his golden gaze burned into her, she knew there was no turning back. Something had begun between them. Something forbidden. Something irreversible. And for the first time in her immortal life, Celine did not care. The night had never felt so alive. The air between them crackled with something raw, something unspoken, a force neither of them could control anymore. Darian stood before her, his chest rising and falling with the remnants of his hunt. The scent of blood clung to his skin, a savage contrast to the ethereal stillness of the woman before him. Celine, queen of the night, a creature meant to be untouchable. Yet here she was, caught in the gravity of his presence. She should have walked away, should have turned to mist and vanished into the cold abyss of the forest. But her feet refused to move, her body betraying her. And he knew it. Darian closed the distance in a single, slow step. Tell me to leave, Celine. His voice was low, rough, a growl edged with desire. She met his gaze, her violet eyes flashing with something deadly. Daring. I do not take orders from beasts. A slow, wicked smirk curled his lips. No. His hand shot out. Fast, brutal, inescapable. Fingers wrapped around her delicate wrist, pulling her closer with effortless strength. She did not resist. Not truly. She let herself be drawn into him, into the heat radiating from his body. A stark contrast to her unnatural coldness. Darian's breath was warm against her cheek, his scent, smoke, blood, and something purely male, wrapped around her like a snare. You feel it, don't you? His lips were inches from hers, taunting, tormenting. Celine hated how much she did. How long had it been since she had felt anything at all? Centuries of numbness, of untouched skin, of hollow hunger. And now, with him so close, it was unbearable. She could hear his heartbeat, furious and wild. Could feel the sheer force of him, the undeniable dominance in his stance. This was wrong. A queen did not bend. A vampire did not burn. And yet, she was burning. Her voice was a whisper, sharp as a blade. You are dangerous, wolf. Darian's fingers slid higher, brushing the curve of her throat. He could feel it, the stillness of her body, the silence where a heartbeat should be. And yet she was trembling. Not from fear. From want. He exhaled a dark chuckle. So are you, my queen. His lips brushed against hers. Not a kiss. Not yet. A challenge. A question. A dare. Celine should have ended it. Should have killed him. Instead, her hands moved, trailing up his arms, feeling the raw power beneath his skin. The heat, the life. Her fingers tangled in his hair, pulling him closer, until there was no space left between them. Then let us be dangerous together. Darian growled, a sound of pure possession. Then, at last, he took her. The kiss was not gentle. It was war. A collision of fangs and fury, a battle between ice and fire. Celine shuddered as his arms locked around her, crushing her against him, forcing her to feel every inch of his strength. He was unstoppable, unyielding. And she, a creature of the void, let herself be conquered. For the first time in centuries, Celine felt alive. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. This moment marks the breaking point, a surrender neither of them can take back. Their passion is both dangerous and inevitable, binding them together in ways they never expected. The night had not yet ended, yet everything had changed. Celine lay draped in the aftermath of their collision, her pale skin marked by his touch, a wolf's claim upon the queen of the night. She should have felt nothing. And yet, she felt everything. The weight of Darian's arm across her waist was impossibly warm, anchoring her to a reality she had spent centuries avoiding. His breath was still ragged, his body tense even in the stillness, a predator who had tasted something forbidden and could never turn back. Neither of them could. She turned her head slightly, her gaze tracing the brutal beauty of the man beside her. His features, chiseled and sharp, held the wildness of the beast he barely contained. But he had not contained it with her. He had unleashed it, and she had let him. Celine exhaled softly, forcing her mind to sharpen against the haze of pleasure. What have I done? She had mocked the idea of mortal reproduction, of frail bodies entwining with purpose. She had laughed at such things. Now, a wolf had stolen her breath, had buried himself so deeply into her that she swore she could still feel him, branding her with something she did not understand. Darian shifted beside her, his golden eyes flickering open. Celine should have spoken, should have demanded distance, should have reclaimed her throne of ice. But the way he looked at her stole her will. His gaze was possessive, burning. "Mine," he murmured, his voice thick with something primal. Her lips parted, but no words came. His fingers brushed her throat, then lower, tracing the delicate lace of shadows that draped her skin, a ghost of a caress that sent fire through her veins. She caught his wrist, her grip deceptively gentle. "Do not be mistaken, Wolf. You do not own me." Darian smirked, a predator humoring his prey. "No. Tell me then, why haven't you left?" Celine stiffened. She should have left. She should have disappeared into mist the moment their hunger had been sated. Should have let him wake alone, wondering if she had been nothing more than a fevered dream. And yet, Darian's grip tightened ever so slightly, pulling her closer. His lips brushed her ear, his voice a whisper of dark amusement. "You are still here because you crave me, Celine, just as I crave you." A slow chill coiled through her. Not fear, never fear, but something far more dangerous. Because he was right. Celine was drawn to him in a way that defied reason. A queen bound to nothing, now ensnared by a creature she had once loathed. Her nails pressed into his skin, sharp enough to draw the faintest beads of crimson. A warning, a challenge. "Be careful, Wolf. You may think you have won, but I do not break so easily." Darian chuckled, low and knowing. "Then I suppose I will just have to keep trying." Before she could escape, before she could reclaim the coldness she had wielded for centuries, he kissed her. It was not gentle. It was possession, a raw, unrelenting claim. And Celine, the untouchable queen of the night, let herself be taken again. The world beyond them stirred, the forces that governed their kind whispering warnings upon the wind. This was not love. This was war. And neither of them would survive it unchanged. The air between them had changed. It was no longer just desire, no longer just hunger. Something darker stirred beneath their skin, curling around their souls like the roots of an ancient curse. Celine stood at the edge of the moonlit chamber, draped in the remnants of their war, a queen undone by the hands of her sworn enemy. Darian watched her from the shadows, his golden eyes molten with possession. A beast who had claimed his mate, yet knew the battle was far from over. She had not fled, and he had not let her go. The night had taken them both, leaving its mark in ways neither could yet understand. Celine's fingers trailed over her own wrist, where his grip had bruised her pale skin. A werewolf's strength imprinted upon an immortal body that should have healed instantly. But she still bore the evidence of his touch. Why? Darian moved before she could unravel the question. He was behind her in an instant, his heat a sharp contrast to her eternal cold. She did not flinch, but he could feel the tension in her body, the war raging inside her, one she would never admit to. His fingers brushed the curve of her neck. She tensed. "You feel it, don't you?" His voice was low, dangerous. Something has changed. Celine's gaze remained fixed on the darkness beyond the chamber. Nothing has changed. Wolf. A dark chuckle rumbled from his chest. Liar. Before she could turn, before she could summon the ice in her veins, he spun her to face him. The queen of the night, caught in the grasp of a predator who feared nothing. And yet, he feared this. Darian's hand slid to her waist, fingers tightening, as though she might vanish if he did not hold her in place. His wolf, his very soul, was howling for her. She was his. The truth of it was as undeniable as the moon itself. And yet, the realization came with a price. Celine was watching him, her gaze sharp, unreadable. Then, with slow, deliberate grace, she lifted her hand and pressed her palm to her stomach. Darian's breath caught. The air grew still. His pulse roared in his ears as he stared at her, at the place where something impossible could be growing. No, he rasped, though he already knew. Felt it. Celine's lips curled, her expression unreadable. You mock the idea, yet your heart is racing. Wolf. Darian's mind warred against the truth, but his instincts, his beast, already knew. A child. A thing that should not exist. A werewolf's seed should never take root in a vampire's womb. It was an abomination, an impossibility. The laws of their world forbade it. Nature itself rejected it. And yet, Celine's eyes gleamed with something he could not name. It seems fate has a cruel sense of humor. Darian's fingers curled into fists. The thought of her carrying something that belonged to him, asterisk of her body sheltering a part of him, asterisk was both intoxicating and terrifying. Because this was not just a life. This was a curse. A prophecy whispered in shadows. A war waiting to be born. Celine tilted her head, watching him carefully. What will you do now, Wolf? Will you run? Will you pretend this never happened? Darian exhaled, his breath ragged, his body strung tight with too many emotions at once. Then, with slow certainty, he reached for her. His palm settled over hers, pressing against the impossible life stirring within her. I will do what I was born to do. His voice was steady, unyielding. I will fight, and I will kill anyone who dares to take you from me. A slow, dangerous smile curved Celine's lips. Good, she murmured. Then let them come. Beyond the chamber, the night trembled. The stars bore witness, and the world began to change.